doing most of the time.
Hmm.
Dan Clowes talks about being a famous cartoonist like being a famous badminton player.
Yeah.
It's very specific to a small group of people. But
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I am with Eisner Award winner, Harvey Award winner, Ignatz Award winner, and I'm pretty sure this is a first and maybe an only for this whole channel, Grammy nominee, Craig Thompson. Hi, Craig. How are you doing?
good, great to be here. Thank you.
As I understand it, you're in the middle of moving.
Yep, today is my packing day. Yesterday was my very last working day drawing new pages in Minneapolis, and I'm heading back to the West Coast.
Oh, so you were doing it for Ginseng Roots.
Partly, I was doing it for Ginseng Roots research and for pandemic isolation purposes. I have been living in Portland, Oregon, the last couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
and then around this time last year, my brother invited me to come live with him in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I just kind of kept pushing that invite, procrastinating on it, even though it was appealing. And then finally, pandemic hit, and I couldn't really bear the isolation of living alone in Portland. So once things kind of like smoothed out a little, I packed my car and drove out here. So I've been here for 4 months, and I've loved it. But there's always been like a little bit of a deadline on this because his girlfriend is moving in tomorrow.
Oh,
So
okay.
and they've been planning this for a while, so it's not like the carpet's being yanked out from underneath me.
Well,
But
you planned out for it.
yeah, but I thought, oh, it's snowing right now outside. So I'm going to be leaving snow and going to, I'm going back to Los Angeles, which is where I was living before Portland,
Oh,
and
okay.
going to live with a friend again because I'm kind of into this housemate situation. Now that it's pandemic, it's like I kind of got to live around someone, have that kind of constant contact.
I get the feeling from a lot of your work that just the general idea of being around someone and constantly communicating and interacting with someone is very important to you. You're
You
not a
mean like
hermit.
codependence?
I don't think so.
No, yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, I'm not in that sense, I'm not a true cartoonist. Like a lot of cartoonists are maybe a little bit more reclusive than me. I mean, it took me 7 years to do Habibi, so I have this ability to kind of go into my cave
Hmm.
for years on end. But yeah, I still need kind of daily contact with people. Otherwise, you go totally insane. Like a lot of people, the way they're feeling during this pandemic is kind of how, to some degree, to a small degree, what cartoonists feel all the time, because you're just like alone all day, hunched over the drawing desk, isolated from humans, not really getting out in public. So that, yeah, I always need to counteract that with some sort of social connection.
But I mean, you bring up Habibi, and even Habibi is about, a couple of people just making a connection and finding each other and, staying with each other and after everything that's happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like a connection is a very strong theme in all of your works.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. Have you ever seen that Alexander Payne movie about Schmidt? It's with Jack Nicholson.
No, I
It's
haven't.
Alexander Payne. He's one of my favorite American filmmakers. I think he's best known for The Election with Matthew Broderick.
Okay.
Uh, but every single one of his films is super super great. But this movie takes place like in Illinois, in the kind of neck of the woods I'm living in right now, like the upper Midwest of the United States. It's very stoic sort of portion of the country. Like people people are very kind of like buttoned up with their feelings, and you don't really communicate those things a lot. So I grew up in that kind of household, very stoic. You're not really allowed to have feelings or communicate them. So comics became this sort of lifeline for me to communication.
This is this is a little strange from the other times I do the interviews because you're saying things about your personal life, and a part of me wants to say like, Yeah, I know. You've told us, but
That's the thing, I guess, with
yeah.
autobio comics, right? Is like there is this element that you kind of use up some of your personal stories in the work.
Goodbye Chunky Rice came out 1999. Do you realize that if it were a person, he'd be old enough to drink?
Older, yeah. Yeah, we were gonna do some events this last year for its 20th anniversary. Last year we were,
Yeah.
and that just kind of spiraled out of control. But a part of it was actually just the working on Ginseng Roots. I didn't have enough time to go on like a Chunky Rice, anniversary tour. So we're gonna have to hold off to 25th anniversary, assuming the pandemic is smoothed out by then.
It's pretty clear to me that Chunky Rice still holds a special place in your heart. I mean, your username right now is a reference to Chunky Rice.
Yeah, I guess I don't even know if that's conscious.
And and it's one of, I think when I first saw it, the reason that I was able to see it was because I was on a big Alan Moore kick at the time, and he wrote a blurb for your book about how experimental you are and how much you play with the form of comics. How did it feel like getting an endorsement from a guy who's
It was
probably, I think, won more Eisners than anyone else?
yeah, that was huge. I mean, I was blown away. I'm still super grateful, bless his soul. The insecure side of me thinks that he was just giving that blurb as a favor to my publisher, Top
Top
Shelf
shelf.
Productions, because they went on to publish Moore and Campbell. But regardless, no, I'm very grateful, and that kind of endorsement that early in your career, like it just means so much at that point, to get sort of like the blessing of like a master.
I don't think he was doing it just as a favor, just because he did everything he said was true. You were very experimental in it, and you still continue to be experimental. You have one page in it that was an establishing shot of a house, and then on the sides you were zooming in on each character in the establishing shot. I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that prior to you. Do you pick that up from anyone, or like how did you come up with an idea like that? Or even there was one where the twins were talking about the doctor who said that they couldn't be cut apart, and you had a bubble within a bubble within a bubble.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I can see strangely the influence of Chris Ware in Chunky Rice. I mean,
Mhm.
it's pretty abstract, but probably that like sort of kind of formalistic experimentation came from being a fan of Chris Ware's Acme Novelty at that time. Otherwise, I don't know. I wasn't like stealing that specific example from anywhere, though. I was, yeah, really curious about manipulating this new, medium for me.
I've always wanted to ask this: which character in Chunky Rice are you?
Definitely chunky, and that kind of
Okay.
goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about growing up in a very stoic household, kind of non-communicative household. Um, I was barely verbal until my 20s.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, that's an exaggeration,
Yeah.
really, but I mean, I was not. Yeah, I was very quiet, shy, awkward, kind of emotionally stunted sort of character, maybe typical of cartoonists, but yeah, I didn't, again, like, yeah, and going back to what I was saying about comics was this kind of vehicle I had for expressing things because I didn't really have the verbal communication skills.
Who at the time was Dandel in your life?
So I created that book when I moved away from Wisconsin, which is my
Mhm.
home state, and moved to Oregon, Portland, Oregon. And, you know, so there was a first draft of that book. It was going to be a mini comic. And the mini comic had these short stories about specific friends of mine. So I'd spend like 3-4 pages writing kind of a letter in comics form to a friend. And then there'd be 2 pages of the little Chunky Rice character in between them. So that was the book I was working on. And when I moved to Portland, I looked up. I kind of had like my Rolodex of like mini comics friends around the U.S. And I had some friends in Seattle and some friends in Portland. One of the friends in Portland was this guy who was just a bartender at an Italian restaurant named Brett Warnock. And so I looked him up, and he was doing this little like homemade comics anthology called Top Shelf. So that's the origins of that company.
Okay.
And
That's
I
history.
met up. Yeah, I met up with Brett. I met him at the bar where he worked, and but then he visited me at one point, and he saw what I was working on, and he said, "Oh, all these stories about your friends are too personal," because they were kind of like intimate letters to individuals. But he's like, this little turtle guy, I like him. If you did a whole book of this guy, I would publish it. So that was sort of the prompt to single out the turtle cartoon Chunky character.
Hmm.
So to answer your question, I mean, like the book itself was kind of inspired by missing a lot of different friends, but I definitely had a heartbreak too that prompted my move. Like I was in a very short first love sort of relationship in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when that fell apart, I just kind of left and got as far as I could in the United States, just drove to the, well, I didn't drive. I flew to the West Coast.
Is that the same first love as documented in Blankets? Or is it
Yes.
okay?
Same person.
Same person. You know, so I'm going to edit this next part out. But a lot of people think that you were referring to Raina Telgemeier.
Yes. You don't even have to edit that out because, yeah, Raina and I have both heard that a lot,
Uh,
especially
yeah.
because her name came out on the scene. There wasn't a lot of well-known Rainas, so as soon as Raina, and I remember there was a photo of us at like Comic-Con that like was circulating, and that's when everyone's like, is this the Raina from the book? So, no, we both think that's funny.
Oh, and now you're both two of the highest selling cartoonists.
I don't compare to her at all. Like she's a true superstar. I mean, she's tapped an entirely different market, like
Mhm.
so she sells in the millions. I think that's true. I don't think that's hyperbole.
It's true, but I mean, your books are also evergreen. They're just continuously in print.
Yeah, which I'm grateful for, and that's true. Yeah.
So with Blankets, I mean, you read autobio comics and you kind of feel like you know the person, but you did omit some stuff, which you outline later on in Ginseng Roots. What led you to omit, one very important member of your family, your sister?
So when the first draft of Blankets, I was not going for autobio. I was trying to change every detail, and sort of the autobio element kind of emerged in spite of myself. I think it was taking more work to change things than not. So then I realized like, well, this is me and this is my family. I'm just going to draw it as is, at reality based. But all the scenes, like my sister was barely in the narrative. She was always like relegated to the background. I felt like that was even more insulting than cutting her out altogether. So there was a lot of there was a lot of elements I had to just carve away. And working on the book kind of prompted these first kind of intimate discussions with my brother and sister. But one of the early ones with my sister was like, yeah, I think I'm going to do a book about our family, but you're not going to be in there. And she was she was like, oh, good, I'm relieved, like she was happy to not have to worry about her depiction. But yeah, it's a weird choice. I don't know if I would do that now, but at the same time, I'm like, wasn't that close to my sister growing up, so she was a background character in my childhood. Everything was my brother and I.
Is that a product of your traditional upbringing?
Uh, Probably that's part of it, and then also I think my brother and I just shared the same interests, drawing, comics, later skateboarding. We used to make these homemade movies, so we just had all this overlap in our interests. But yeah, and maybe part of that just sort of like I don't know. We weren't again a very communicative family, so there wasn't necessarily this ingrained inclusiveness. So it actually was kind of a miracle that I bonded so closely with my brother, considering we weren't that kind of intimate family. So,
And now you're living with them.
Yeah. Yeah. My brother and I are still super close. You know, we
Yeah.
probably went through a spell ages like 16 or ages 20 to 30 or something for me, that we weren't that close, like our early adult life. But then when I started working on blankets, that's when we started to like kind of create a new bond. I guess there was like 10 years there. Somewhere in our teenage years, we kind of fell out of close connection. And then working on blankets is what got us back together.
You're a good few years apart, though, right?
3 years, yeah.
3 years, yeah. I think when you get to the teenage years, that feels like a very large gap. And then you get to your 20s, and then all of a sudden 3 years is nothing.
You're right,
Yeah.
totally.
So with blankets, I just want to say it's one of the books that helped me. Like it helped put a lot of perspective into my life, actually, because I was also going through a similar crisis of faith at the time when the book came out, and it was nice to read a book that understood where I was coming from. Did you realize that by being so specific about your experience, you were actually being universal?
No, not at all. I didn't expect that. Um, I mean, that book benefits. I say this often in interviews that book benefits from me not being aware of a readership or audience,
Mm-hmm.
because the first book, Goodbye Chunky Rice, didn't really sell many copies. So I
Really?
didn't think anybody would see blankets. Yeah, you seem surprised, but Chunky Rice was a very, very modest, indie cult hit, basically. It sold maybe 2,000 copies, 2 to 4, and that was accumulated. So I was like, oh, maybe 2,000 people will see blankets. That was the biggest audience I could imagine, and I thought it might be off-putting to a lot of people because I knew it was really personal and specific to a specific location, in like this real rural community in the middle of nowhere in like a small town, Wisconsin. In a very specific kind of religious family, not like a generically Catholic Christian or something like I thought that most people were used to,
Mm-hmm.
a very specific, like working class evangelical family. And then it proved the opposite, basically. Like you said, like the themes ended up being quite universal, but I didn't know that really going in. I didn't think anyone would read the book, honestly. But
Is it
that made me very free to just express myself and not worry about the expectation of the reader.
is it your best-selling book? Do you know?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's no doubt.
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically the only thing that sustains my career.
Like if you did nothing for the rest of your career, you could live off of the royalties?
Oh no,
Okay.
not that. It's not that potent. I still got to make new things, but
Uh-huh.
no, it wouldn't be enough to have a working class income, for instance. But like it seems like each book sells a little less than that follows. Um,
I get you.
and if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to survive as a cartoonist. I'd have to probably quit.
Well, it's a good thing you have it then, because we all are really appreciative of your work.
Oh, thank you.
And with blankets as well, you I was surprised actually to see your style translate to humans, because of course I was coming from Chunky Rice. But it really and even the humans in Chunky Rice were over exaggerated, but
Yeah.
in blankets you had them, they were very realistically proportioned. I mean, it was still cartooning, but yeah. So I just wanted to say that about blankets, basically.
No, it took me a lot of effort to make that transition, actually, because Chunky
Really?
Rice is more pure to how the way I drew. I was really influenced by Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes and Dr. Seuss. Those are basically my big inspirations. I was into cartoony, cutesy kind of style. And then when I got back into comic books, it was Jeff Smith's Bone. But I liked the more the like pogo cute
Yeah.
part of bone more than I like the human elements. So yeah, then I started to get influenced a lot by that certain wave of French cartoonists, the L'Association crew that showed up in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
People like Blutch, probably most of all, but Baudouin, Blutch, Louis Trondheim, David Bay, um, that crew. And a lot of them had that, French cartoonists in general had that really expressive brush line, more of like a painterly brush line. And that was something I really kind of envied and I wanted to learn that, and I wanted to learn how to draw human beings. But there's a lot of mistakes in blankets, and actually the cartoonist James Sturm, who at this point is famous for running the CCS, the cartooning school,
Yeah.
here in the U.S. He was one of the first people to point out to me like a lot of the problems in my anatomy, and one of the biggest ones is he would just say, like, you draw hands and feet twice the size they should be. And he was totally right. And then it's still a thing I do. I think it's maybe part of my style.
I just thought that was part of your style. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm not doing it on purpose. It's kind of happens again, in spite of I wish things were more maybe accurate and anatomically, but it's just like, that's kind of the style that emerges.
I don't think it looks bad.
Oh, good.
I thought that was your style in general.
Yeah, I don't know. Hands, for instance, are such good expressive tools that I think it's just I require to draw them bigger. And I draw everything with a brush. I have got a bunch of these. That's a bad brush, but all my work is drawn with a watercolor brush, so it just ends up. I don't have the same kind of delicate precision as, say, someone who uses a pen or digital media.
Yeah. So the brush line is exactly like, for me, the trademark of your work. You talked about growing up in a very stoic household, and I know that the book caused some friction for you and your family afterwards. Did it just take them by surprise that you had feelings?
That's not probably what was most jarring for them. I mean, the most jarring is that they want me to be a Christian, and they said that because I'm not, I'm going to hell. And that's pretty heavy, to be like, believe your children are going to spend eternity suffering in hell. Obviously it's heavy for them, but it's also heavy for me too, because it's like, wait, you're like kind of executing this sentence on me that I'm going to be punished forever, just because I don't believe the same thing as you. So that was pretty much, especially with my mom, that was the hardest part for her to kind of recover from. I don't know if she ever has fully. I mean, and it's very weird to feel like someone loves me but doesn't accept me. I think that's probably a common thing with a lot of people's relationships with their parents, to feel loved but not accepted. And that's a contradiction.
Yeah. That's very, I mean, I feel like we're hearing a lot of those stories a lot in, recent years when, people, I mean, it's not the same as coming out or anything like that, but it is very of a similar bent. So that's very interesting.
I mean, I would not say that, but I do have gay friends who have told me that before, that Blankets is a coming out story. So they're allowed to say that. I might not be, but yeah, it's a form of a coming out story, I guess.
Yeah.
Because in some ways there is still this like judgment and rejection that can happen from the parental side for not just believing. It is kind of at the core of the same thing. Oh, you don't believe what we believe, and we believe what you believe or do is sinful or wrong.
So I'll get back to that later when you talk about Ginseng Roots, but I'd like to ask, did it also cause friction with Reina? Did you ever talk to her afterwards?
Yeah, well, so we're still close. But there's complications with the way that went out too, because like the Reina in the book is a fusion of two different relationships.
Really?
Yeah, so that's another one of those sort of like the removing my sister from the narrative. That's like one of those kind of fictions that happens in the course of writing the book. Because the emotional, yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, the person, the main person who was inspiring Reina was, we were not in contact for like a good 10 years. And then we reconnected around a friend's memorial. A friend of ours died. And ever since then, we've been quite close again.
Okay.
And
That's
I think
interesting.
for her, yeah, I honored about blankets.
That's interesting. I didn't know it was two separate relationships.
Yeah, that's something.
Oh.
Yeah, it's something that kind of like there was kind of like surface details that were from one relationship, and then a lot of the emotional and even those sort of conversational details were from another relationship.
That's very interesting. Habibi seems like the exact opposite of blankets. Is that a conscious choice?
Yes, definitely a conscious choice. But it's funny because you were just asking me too about like some of these nuances of autobio and like the fictions that sort of happen.
Mm-hmm.
In a really strange way, Habibi is like more personal, even though it's so abstracted, like there's nothing that's like that directly correlate, like realistic, like realistically correlates to my life, but there's something at its emotional heart that allowed me to be even more honest in a way.
Is it
But
the
yeah, but
idea
as
of
far as,
acceptance?
yeah, and some dynamics of relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly like, like dealing with like sexual trauma and how you recover from that, and learn to heal those things to be in relationship, stuff like that.
Blankets is your best-selling book, but is it safe to say that Habibi has been your most controversial?
Oh, certainly it's my most controversial. I thought you were going to say too is there is something about Habibi that I think people love it more, but people also hate it more. So it's not as universally like accepted. But it's the one that I feel maybe means more to the people it means stuff to.
Mm,
Like that's the
I can see
one
that.
that yeah, that I get some really emotional, like pure emotional, like kind of life-saving sort of like um,
I
reactions.
I feel that of the three books I've mentioned, at least for me, I've always found Chunky Rice to be the most resonant and universal, just because it's so universal. It's about goodbyes and separation. And then Blankets was the one that I felt spoke the most to me. But also Chunky Rice I felt was the most experimental in terms of layouts and the formal aspect of the medium. I thought Habibi was the most artistic that you've done so far. And I can totally see why you took 7 years to draw it. Those patterns are so intricate, and the narrative is so complex that was that tiring?
No, actually, the patterns themselves, that was the only part that was more meditative. I think
Mm,
drawing comics in general is pretty exhausting because you have to draw a page a day, and you have to draw all these things you don't want to draw. Like for me, a lot of that's like architecture and cars. I like drawing organic things, nature, water, humans. I don't like drawing architecture and perspective lines, but that's just what the medium requires. It's like, oh, this is what I got to draw today, like these tedious indoor scenes. But when I was working on those patterns in Habibi, that was like the one place where I can kind of just get into a meditative state. Like, oh, all I have to do today is this whole page of ornamentation. I felt like I was tapping kind of the space that like craftspeople around the world must be in when they're making, quilts or, you
yeah.
know, pottery or, it felt much more craft than art in a good way. And I love the thing about craft is I feel like craft is kind of about, it's sort of selfless in a way. There's something like you're kind of sacrificing your time to make a beautiful object, whereas art has a narcissistic sort of side to it. Like it's about me. Like, look at me. I made this painting, you know, where
Yeah.
craft, the kind of craft you see all around the world and developing countries and whatnot is more selfless.
Can you talk to me about the juxtaposition between blankets, where blankets and Habibi, where blanket seems to be you coming out that you're no longer a Christian, you no longer believe in this religion, whereas Habibi, you're taking this other religion, Islam, and you're trying to kind of fix the public perception of it. So it seems like you're going in two different directions with two different religions.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, that's probably a good way to describe it, actually, because it was born in the wake of 9/11, where there was this whole wave of, I feel like I've said this many times before in interviews, but this wave of Islamophobia in the States,
Mhm.
you know, it was kind of rampant everywhere. It hasn't gone away, but it was really pronounced at that time and exaggerated, you know, and embarrassing to be American and see people behaving the way they were towards Muslims or people that they thought were of Arabic descent. You know, it wasn't even specific to, it was just anybody with questionable ethnicity. You know, there was this racism in the States. I mean, in that sense, things haven't changed here. And as for my own part, like I at that point, that was like 2003 or four that I was starting that project. I didn't really have any friends who were Muslim. You know, I didn't really know much about the faith. So there's a big deficiency in my, you know, knowledge too. So in the same way that blankets kind of prompted me to reach out to my siblings and start kind of unearthing these sort of personal family intimacies, uh, Habibi prompted me to like kind of start learning about Islam and meeting Muslims and making those connections. And for me, very early on, like the instant first realization is like, oh, this is exactly the same as Christianity. Like they really kind of spring from the same source, same morals, same stories, you know, really the same family dynamics, you know, like anyone who's grown up in a, you know, a religious Muslim family, it's pretty much, it can correspond almost exactly to a religious Christian family, especially. And the fundamentalism looks the same in both, I think.
I think so too. Uh, so the fundamentalism is extreme regardless of the ideology. With that, why do you think people, you know, tend to focus on the differences between the religions as opposed to the similarities, which you do talk about in Habibi, about how they all come from the same well. You even draw out
Mm-hmm.
a whole tree of the lineages.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, I am always asking this question why everybody's always creating boundaries. I mean, that's a big theme of Habibi, is this sort of like letting go of these imaginary boundaries we set up between people, you know, gender, culture, you know, religion, all those sort of dynamics. Um, and I maybe that's a common thread through a lot of my work. I think the Ginseng Roots has some of that too, but um, no, that's always a question I'm asking myself: is like, why do we create all these boundaries in our society? You know, between people and you know, ideas. And of course, America is suffering pretty bad right now because of this polarization, you know, political polarization and tribalism and uh, us versus them. I mean, you know, people talk about us being on the verge of civil war here, you know, and it just seems absurd that it's 2020 and people are still like creating that sort of dynamic of us versus them, which kind of just goes down to creating an imaginary boundary.
Yeah, for the context of the people watching, today is October 23rd, 2020. If this goes up after November 3rd, and what Craig says might happen will happen, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I hope not. But I'm talking about internal strife. But
Yeah.
you know, obviously, America's gone through this terrible narrative too of being anti-immigration and whatnot too, which is the same narrative of like it seems like the platonic ideal of what the country is supposed to be represent is like the melting pot of accepting people from refugees from wherever. But of course, that's not what exists in practice. So I think that's a disturbing observation about the world in general right now, is that sort of
Yeah.
like just like nobody accepts refugees, you know, like
Mhm.
because they've created imaginary boundaries that they're the outsiders, you know, and this is our space, our territory.
People can't imagine themselves being in that position, so they don't empathize.
Mm-hmm.
What what effect do you think growing up in a stoic household, and basically a household where you struggle to be accepted, uh, do you think that affects you and your own ability to be accepting of people, and to be non-judgmental of people?
Hmm. In some ways, it has the opposite effect because I kind of like my rebellion when I was like in my early 20s was to be, um, uh, well, yeah, to be super acceptant and liberal, you know,
Mhm.
and kind of go through that whole like I was only in art school for one semester, but to go through that very like kind of a free spirit, you know, like I got, you know, I experienced the 60s and the 70s in my own life on a micro scale, you know, where I had to be liberated and experiment and be open to all people. And, you know, so I, you know, I'm not as maybe as crazy now at this age, but, you know, I think that stuck with me, this sort of acceptance of all different people and lifestyles.
Yeah.
So I didn't inherit that from my parents.
No, it's something that you came with on your own.
Hmm.
And the world is better for that. So let's talking about your family. Let's talk about Ginseng Roots. Is that you?
It is. Yep.
And so Ginseng Roots, like I said, you read an autobio comic and you think you know the person, but Ginseng Roots talks about something you didn't talk about in Blankets at all. Can you talk to us about your time working at these ginseng farms?
Well, yeah. So first off, though, like Ginseng Roots is autobio, and I was very reluctant to do autobio again for a number of reasons. One, because I'd done it before. Two, because my parents did not react well the first time around. And I don't know. I just yeah, and I guess it's hard to be um, truly honest in some ways with autobio, you know, because you do have to move things around and people think of, you know, like it's just so with Ginseng Roots right away I wanted to acknowledge the sort of flaws in autobio, you know, because there is no true documentary. You know, in fact, now that I'm doing something that's sort of documentary work in comics form,
Mhm.
it just makes me more aware that it's documentary is like the most contrived medium. You know, you have to take everything around you and condense it into something small. So certainly you're editing and chiseling away, but you're also moving things around, and somebody says something, and depending what context I put them saying that, you know, it might affect the meaning of that. So there, it's not, it's not, true, you know, it's not real in a way. So there's this
I get you.
contradiction of like, oh, I'm trying to depict as faithfully as possible a documentary about growing up in this ginseng world, but you know, just the nature of drawing comics and documentary, it ends up being manipulated by the author. I think that's true maybe of all media though too. Is like people like the Trumpers use the term fake news. To some degree, all news is fake, you know, because it's just the nature of the medium when you're trying to condense the chaos of reality into the simplicity of a story. It's going to be manipulated.
I get you. It's like there's some things that you might omit because you don't think it's necessary for the context, but for some people, it might be necessary for the context. So
And it's
I
very
get what you're
subjective
saying.
what you decide is the important element, you know? And a lot of the throwout, like the things that you trim away on the cutting room floor, those are entire books in their own right. And I'm aware of that. You know, oh, there's a book, but I don't have space or room. You got to let go of that one. You know.
That's very interesting because that would lead credence to the idea that what you're doing, because you are doing it in cartooning form. So this is what's important to you. This is what's important to your story. Now, if somebody
Mhm.
else wants to tell their part of the story, they're free to.
Exactly. And I also acknowledge in the very first issue of the series that I had started research on this project. I wanted to do a book about ginseng, and in the course of my research, I read a couple of books
Mm-hmm.
that basically had already written the book for me. Independent of my own research, and I had already started some interviews, and then I found these books and I read them. I'm like, oh, they wrote my book already. They already exist. The ginseng project exists. But then I realized, oh, the thing that makes this different is one, it's drawn, and
Mm-hmm.
doing a graphic novel about ginseng like really allows all this, these avenues to visually explore that can be really exciting. And then two, I'm the only, like both of the authors I had read didn't grow up working in ginseng or in cultivation. So I was like, oh, this personal element is actually one of the most potent elements of this project.
Can you talk to me about growing up in that environment?
Yeah, and even in that sense, I'm not the ideal person because I didn't like my parents weren't ginseng farmers. We were a poor working class family, and my brother and I, and not really my sister, she was mostly babysitting, but my brother and I were just kind of farm boys that would do farm labor for money, for basically to buy our comic books. But we started working when I was 10 years old and he was 7 years old, working 40-hour weeks through the summer. So that was our summer vacations. And we just go work for the ginseng farmers in their farms. And how popular or well known is ginseng in the Philippines?
I'll tell you, when I found out that you were working on a book about ginseng, I didn't even know that ginseng existed in the US because
Okay.
I thought it was native to this part of the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that seems
that's how
pretty
popular it
common.
is
I,
here.
I would say most like white Americans barely know what ginseng is. Most people call the book ginger roots when they're talking to me. So
Yeah.
I'd say say like a white American person might not even know what ginseng is, and then they're even more confounded when they learn there's actually a huge cultivation industry in North America.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then friends of mine who are come from like Asian families pretty much know what ginseng is, but
Yeah.
yeah, like you described, they're still surprised that it was a big part of this small town rural America. But my community where I grew up in is just like a town of 1,200 people, like
Hmm.
as small town as they get. And in the 80s and early 90s, it was the biggest producer of cultivated ginseng, American ginseng in the world. So it's totally crazy now looking back. When I was a kid, I didn't even think about it. It was like, oh, this is just what our town does. They grow ginseng. But now that now looking back, I'm like, that was really odd. And that's a whole nother microcosm I kind of grew up in. Not only like the weird evangelical church and a small town, but also this ginseng agriculture.
Yeah, ginseng is known for health benefits, basically.
Yes,
Let's put
so
it
it's
that
very
way.
popular in Chinese medicine. You could argue that's probably the second most important herb after the reishi mushroom, as far as its like importance both like in terms of health benefits, but also maybe culturally. Like there's so much like mythology and stuff that surrounds the ginseng root. And there are at least two different strains. There's like Asian ginseng, which is more young, sort of energizing, warming, energizing sort of character. And then American ginseng, which is a sister species. They're kind of perfect complements, which is more yin. It's a more a cooling adaptogen, they would call it. It's
Hmm.
being used already, like for like a lot of cancer recovery, like chemo recovery, because I guess an adaptogen is something that sort of nourishes every part of your body. And Wisconsin ginseng is very sought after in China. It's sort of like the primo, because whereas Asian ginseng is this really fiery medicine that you can use in extreme circumstance to like cure an illness, American ginseng is something you can take every day, like a
Yeah.
multivitamin, and it has these very nourishing properties.
What led you to do this comic in monthly issues? Or sorry, not monthly, single issues. This is new for you.
Yeah, that's probably the first reason. It's something I've never done. So I always like to switch it up and try something new with each project. So the book before this, Space Dumplings, is in color, and that was a new thing. And of course, like you said, Habibi is quite different from Blankets, and Blankets is humans versus funny animals.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never done comic books, and I also had that envy, this sense of missing out. Like I missed out on this whole era of especially like 90s indie comics.
Yeah.
There was this kind of sweet spot in American publishing, or even like the 1980s black and white explosion that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sparked.
Mm-hmm.
That
You were
was the
talking
comic
about Bone
book.
earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the Turtles, that's what my brother and I were reading when we were kids. We were obsessed with black and white comics, Usagi Yojimbo, all these funny animal explosion era comics. But I never had a chance to do a serial. So there was like this feeling of having missed out. Also, that's really the form of comics that imprinted on me, and it has like the most, at least nostalgia for me, is the comic book. But I'm too late to the game, really. I mean, like when I was working on Blankets, all my cartoonist friends were telling me I was crazy that I was going to do it as one book. They're like, do it as a serial. What are you talking about? Everybody does black and white comic books, you know? So it seemed like this kind of Noah building the ark sort of project where people are like, you're going to publish that as just one book? That's insane. Like, do it as comic books. And now it's the other way around. People are like, why are you doing this as comic books? People only care about graphic novels. They don't care about the issues. But
so also this is in black and white and red. What led to that decision as well?
early on, I was experimenting with some different things. I kind of wanted to watercolor the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was experimenting a lot with like really organic tones. I was using this walnut ink, which is actually like pretty organic and just derived from walnut shells, and it has these really earthy brown tones. That's kind of what I wanted to paint the book in. But I was doing experiments with like reproduction of that. You know, it's difficult to control. And then when I decided to do comic books with Uncivilized, that's a small publisher here in Minneapolis, he proposed just adding a second color, which then changed my direction from watercolors to looking at like old printmaking, especially like classic Chinese and Japanese wood blocks, you know. And it's so, if you look at like Hokusai's manga from you know, like the origin of that term, when was that book printed? I should know this better, but certainly it was like the 1800s, or is whenever like they were first like learning how to mass produce books on that scale. Hokusai, who's famous for his wave, created like basically a visual encyclopedia. I think it was made originally for art students to learn how to observe and draw everything. So he would draw peasants working in the field, every form of vegetation and of wildlife, animals, rocks, and just put it in this massive multi-volume printed book. But it had like two colors, basically. It had a black and an orangish, cadmium orange sort of color, and then a gray from the black. And I just loved the elegance of that, but also the sort of callback to like the printing press, you know, like as much as Ginseng Roots is kind of an ode to this lost era of comic books, it's also like I'm still trying to hold on to print media for a little bit longer. I know it's going away. You know, everything's digital. Everybody draws digital now. People consume their comics digitally now. But I still kind of like want to hold on to the object of the printed page for a little bit longer. It might be. Yeah. You too, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I still got bookshelves, so
yeah,
it's worth the extra space.
Yeah.
I mean, digital's probably going to be the way to go eventually. I just hope.
Yes, because I am moving a lot. This is my third move this year. And every time you move, you curse books completely. They're the heaviest thing to move, and they take up way more space than you think. And I'm like, oh yeah,
you're not going to read them all again.
That's the weird thing too, right? Yeah, they're kind of a very heavy, dusty, just like a ornamentation for your home. You know, you're not pulling them off the shelf constantly to reread, especially if they're novels.
But I
But they
mean,
give you some sort of warmth. They're almost like a fireplace.
yeah.
They radiate warmth in a home.
Plus, also, like any given time, you don't know which one you are going to reread again.
Especially with graphic novels. I do think there is something special about comics where it sort of justifies the print media a little bit more and a little bit longer than prose, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because prose, you're not too caught up in the object, you know? I
Yeah.
generally prefer paperbacks if I'm reading a novel and then pass it on to a friend. You know, you don't need to hold on to that object. But with graphic novels, there is that kind of, there's something about revisiting it visually, you know? And it is a different experience depending on the amount of attention or you have to look at those images.
With novels as well, I just feel like whether I'm reading it in book form or I'm reading it on a tablet, I'm still getting the same content in really the same way. But with comics, I feel just, for example, the sheer size, if it's not optimized for a screen, then it doesn't really work. Like if you have a double page spread, but your tablet remains the same size, it's just weird, right?
Yeah, I'm terrible at digital media. I'm not um like a lot of people send me their PDFs, you know, for me to review or give them a blurb. And for me, that's like the most painful thing to try to read a book, a comic book, even on a tablet.
Mm-hmm.
I have no attention span for it. It's just, yeah, it just, I can't do it. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of old fashioned in that sense. And the only context that makes sense to me is like, oh, like you can reduce all the clutter of all your books into something tidy. Like I somehow was okay with converting to digital audio, you know, getting rid of all the CDs and vinyl and being just on Spotify. That I was able to do, but I can't do it with books.
Well, that's also another case where it's pretty much the same thing, unless you're really good at figuring out the differences between the different formats.
Well, I mean, vinyl is had this huge resurgence, you know, and I think it's because the ritual of vinyl. It's like making a pot of coffee or something, like
Mm-hmm.
pulling out a record and dusting it off, and even after you've dusted it, there's still some crackle and stuff in the record. The imperfections are what make it so cozy and warm and human. So I get that, you know. But of course, vinyl's really even heavier than books. So
Also very expensive.
yeah, right,
Is-
yeah.
So with Ginseng Roots, will it be collected at some point, or
Hopefully, I don't have I haven't secured a U.S. publisher yet, but I have already started some contracts with my European publishers.
why did I may edit this out if it's going to cause friction, but why did you move away from Top Shelf?
Oh no, you don't have to edit anything. So Top Shelf. I mean, yeah, that's a long story. So I was there at the very foundation of the company. Like it was not yet. It was just they were actually called Primal Groove Press when I first met Brett, and he published kind of a staple bound anthology called Top Shelf, and and uh, and so yeah, right away, I had this friendship with Brett. He was like a real indie like startup. I was this very beginning cartoonist. We were like totally aligned in our lives, and we just had this handshake agreement for him to publish my first book. But then he teamed up with Chris Staros and Chris Orr to form Top Shelf Productions, and that happened very shortly before Chunky came out. And the kind of the dynamic of the publisher started to switch at that time. Like, and I don't know. I just always struggled with the new like corporatization of the company. Like it started early, you know, like when I agreed to be with Top Shelf with Brett, it was very indie punk rock DIY, you know, small press. And then as soon as the other members came in, it came in with like a corporate sort of attitude right away.
Mm.
By the time I was able to have like a money to pay like a lawyer to look at my contracts, my lawyer was like, these contracts are horrible, you know, and they're asking for way more rights than even like a Marvel or DC would ask.
Really?
of a person. I think that's an exaggeration. I don't think that's true that they asked more than the big two, but it wasn't like it wasn't the Fantagraphics model. Let's say that it wasn't like a really it wasn't in favor of the author. You know, it was more in favor of the company and the IP, the intellectual property that they were gaining. So I don't know. We just had accumulated conflicts around that stuff, you know. And
Yeah,
and
that's
by the time I
interesting.
did Habibi, you know, I wasn't making much money. I wasn't making a living doing comics, but you know, and I'd done 3 books with Top Shelf, which I felt was the fulfillment of my 3-book contract with them, and then they really were trying to lay stake on Habibi, but weren't really offering money for it. So that's just kind of when things fell apart. That was around 2004 when I got a book publisher in New York, Random House Pantheon.
Yeah.
And but for me, that was also the beginning of my professional career because it was the first time I actually had money to focus on making comics exclusively. And
Can I ask you what you were doing before that?
and also yes, I'll get to that. But also then to continue that narrative too. Also, Top Shelf changed yet again around that time too because or it was a little bit later, but they ended up selling to
Knockabout.
no, not Knockabout, a bigger US company, LA based company, IDW. They're what do you call it? They sold the company to IDW and they're imprint of IDW. So that just sort of sealed the deal on it, and them being a much more corporate company than I was comfortable working with. But yeah, before I was the last real job I had is I was a graphic designer at Dark Horse Comics. So the good jobs in my past are doing graphic design. I worked at a newspaper as a graphic designer for a year. I worked at a small town advertising agency, and then I finally got my foot in the door to comics when I got a job as a graphic designer at Dark Horse in Portland, and so I was the guy that would design the logos. There was a lot of production, but you know, like, you know, the inside front covers and the logos and the advertisements. Occasionally you had to do toy packaging, stuff like that. And it was both the best and worst job I've ever had, because it was the best because I was in comics, which was my dream, but it was the worst because I wasn't making comics. I was just like auxiliary doing this kind of tedious work, and maybe only 10% of those Dark Horse books was I excited about. Everything else I felt was garbage. I mean, the Dark Horse publishes some good stuff, but I had a bunch of books that didn't interest me. So it was painful in a way.
Let's get back to Ginseng Roots. I'm sorry we got off track on that one.
That's what podcasts are for, getting off track.
Do you think, or you mean, I mean, I only have issue 2, and in it, your dad or your mom basically says, "Are you going to put this in a comic?" Mm-hmm. You think, are you afraid that this might cause some more friction in your family?
Yeah. So you only have issue 2. There's 7 issues in print right now. And there seems to be kind of a push-pull in the narrative of like issue 1 is kind of an overview of the ginseng work I did as a child. Mm-hmm. Issue 2 is very family focused and kind of exploring those themes about the problems inherent in autobiography. And yes, my mom's resistance, because when I first started interviewing my parents about doing this ginseng work, they had a bunch of stories. As soon as they caught wind that I might be making a book about it, the story stopped. Like, it totally shut them down as far as telling me stories. So there's another problem with autobio. Issue 3 of the book is more about like Chinese mythology and this character of Shenong, the god of farming and medicine. And then issue 4, it goes back to personal stories, doing this menial labor. Issue 5 is about U.S. history and sort of how the earliest explorers in North America and the New World were exporting China starting in 1708. Okay. So it goes back really far. Issue 6, again, is super personal. That's about that's the one I still have been worried to show my parents. It's about how they pulled us out of public school to be Christian homeschooled, which is another element that's not in Blankets. And then issue 7 is about the Hmong immigrant population in Wisconsin and how they shaped the ginseng industry. And so there's this constant kind of back and forth, like really personal stuff and then more
Yeah.
broader historical stuff.
It's an interesting structure, and also like at least in the one issue you have, it's a personal issue. You know, you go back and forth between flashbacks and the present day, kind of like the mouse structure. Um, why do I get the feeling that your mom could get you to stop making the comic if she just asked you flat out?
Ooh,
Could she?
no, I don't think so. But definitely, like my mom's disapproval is emotionally difficult for me. I mean, it kind of shuts me down internally. Um, you know, I'm not. I mean, I always talk about. I mean, every cartoonist I know talks about imposter syndrome and sort of the difficulty of giving yourself permission to make art. You know, like I have a lot of insecurity around that stuff. You know, and I think the core of that struggle for me is like my mother's disapproval. You know, I'd rather make the work that she's proud of. But if I were making the work that she was proud of, I would be making like Veggie Tales, you know, those Christian talking vegetables, which she has suggested to me. She's like, why can't you just make something like Veggie Tales? They're pretty universally known at this point, right? Okay. So if I were making my mom proud, it would be Veggie Tales, but
Yeah. Did she ever do the guilt trip?
it's just like subtle,
yeah.
passive aggressive things. Yeah. But no, I don't think I like to think if she said like just stop this altogether, I wouldn't. But yeah, it is something at the same time, it's something I struggle with every day when I'm getting to the drawing board of like, yeah, knowing when my mom would not approve of what I'm drawing. I can feel her looking over my shoulder.
Does the fact that you've won every major award in comics help with your imposter syndrome at all?
No, no, not at all. And that's also something I think every cartoonist talks about. Like, really, I mean, like it is nice to be acknowledged by the industry and your peers, but it is just comics award too. You know, it's not like people outside of comics are aware of what these awards mean. It's not the Pulitzer Prize or something. And I don't know. Sometimes that just feels like it might be a popularity contest. You know, the awards. You know, like there's just like maybe a year where you happen to be um, on everybody's radar, and then you know people are making amazing books that aren't being acknowledged by their awards. You know, you see who wins the award some year and who loses, and you're like, wait, this is a rigged system. So you know, it's hard to take it too seriously.
I get you, but I mean, it kind of shows that you are a very well respected person in your industry.
Yeah,
And
I forget that often. I don't see myself that way until I'm traveling, really. And maybe that's part of the isolation of just working in your studio. You don't really have a sense that anybody cares about what you're doing most of the time.
mhm.
You know, Dan Clowes talks about being a famous cartoonist like being a famous badminton player. You know,
Yeah.
it's very specific to a small group of people. But also, yeah, no, I don't. It's not until I'm traveling and maybe I'm meeting someone I really respect, a peer, and they're a fan or are well aware of my work that then I'm like, oh, whoa, okay, that's a big deal. I can't believe this person knows who I am. You know?
Like you said to me over email, I mean, got you know, the guy who runs our lead bookstore here really pushes your stuff.
Yeah, bless
So,
his soul, Jaime.
yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing. That I mean, that to me is the most exciting and validating part of my career is this being able to travel and meet readers from the other side of the world and be like, whoa, that blows my mind.
Actually, that's another question I wanted to ask, because I know if Jaime is talking to you and you're talking to Jaime, there's really just one question that is at the bottom of it all. Did you ever plan to come to the Philippines for a signing?
I would love to. I feel like there's been a couple of times a little bit of something that never really panned out fully. It's hard to remember why things don't pan out. Most of the time, it's just a scheduling conflict. It's like, oh, can you be here at this time? And I'm like, no, I'm already there, you know? And then
Mm.
also there's the time when you're in the middle of a project and you're just not gonna, it's just not the time to leave to travel because you're neck deep in your deadlines. So I really want to go to the Philippines, but it hasn't aligned yet. Um, yeah, hopefully those opportunities show up again after this pandemic smooths out.
Well, come in 3 years when we may have a different president. Anyway,
Yeah, here's to both our countries having new presidents.
I
Oh
agree.
man.
So another thing I wanted to ask, you and Phil working on the ginseng farms, did this not go against like laws?
Oh no, yeah. So child labor laws, I guess those started. I should know this history better. I feel like so somewhere in the 1940s that Labor Day was established, and then like they started to institute some laws prohibiting these children working in these factories. But there was always a like a liberal flexibility around farm work, because at that point in America, over 80% of families were farm families. Like that was all of America in the 1940s, and they've never changed that law. So even now, children of a very young age are allowed to do farm work. Only the thing that's shifted is now it's not like white kids doing it anymore. It's not like farm kids that grew up with their parents being the farmers. It's mostly Mexican, laborers, the children of those families. Um, and that's hopefully a dynamic I can explore in this book too. But yeah, now all the 12 and 13-year-olds doing farm labor are Mexican or children of Mexican immigrants.
I don't know how to feel about that. I feel like we just
Oh,
walked into a dark place.
it's horrible. I mean, I think I don't even know what I mean. How to like? I'm exploring it, I guess, a bit in the book, because I do
Yeah.
think it's bad that children have to do this sort of sometimes very dangerous grunt labor. Yeah, actually, there's lots of dangerous things in farm labor. Um, but what's even more horrifying, so it's weird that like the American work ethic has shifted, where um, we no longer let children do, like, I should say white children do this kind of labor. It's like not normal to grow up in a family that would encourage you to do this kind of work. And yet as a society, we're perfectly fine with all that work being done by non-white children. It's
I
pretty disturbing shift.
I asked the question because I wanted to kind of see if they would enforce child labor, if they started enforcing child labor laws after your time or anything. And then the answer
No,
you
it's
give me
still,
is like, oh wow.
yeah, no, if you go out to the fields, I mean, say California has the biggest agricultural, industry, and those fields are full of children who again are there. A lot of their parents are undocumented Mexican immigrants, and then their kids, they just help out with the work, help pay all the family bills. And in Wisconsin, in Ginseng, there's a couple different dynamics going on there now. Now there's like a work program where the ginseng farmers transport Mexican laborers for 6 months of the year. So they do a whole year's worth of farm work in 6 months. And all these, they're just men mostly. And no, there's women too. They leave their families in Mexico. They are put in dormitories on the farms for 6 months of the year. They can't leave the farm because they don't have driver's license. And there's just too much like legal paperwork stuff around if they were to begin any kind of trouble, say like in town, And so you just stay on the farm, you work a 16-hour day, you like party with the guys in the dormitory, and that's just your life for 6 months. There's like 1 month that they can go home. So it's like 3 months on, 1 month you go home to your family, and then 3 months on again. But it's a pretty bleak existence too, to just be isolated from your family for 3 month stretches,
What's the most positive learning you got from the ginseng farms?
Well, so like just a couple of weeks ago, I went back home to help a friend with a ginseng root dig.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a pretty depressing. Now this is another dark story, I guess. It was a bad year for him. Like he was
So
digging
you
up.
still have friends who are into it.
Yeah, this friend I actually. So I have some childhood friends that still do it, and then this is a friend I made over the course of working on the book.
Mm-hmm.
And he was digging up 4.5 acres. So I went to the dig thinking I would just document things and that it would be like 30 people there working, hustling to get all the roots out of the ground. And it was just him and his brother because there was no roots in the ground. They had grown that crop for 4 years. And by the time the harvest happened, the roots had disappeared. So it was a really sad harvest that year. And it was, so there was nothing to document. I just helped them dig roots for about 4 hours. But that was really fun. It was fun to get my hands in the dirt and just have that kind of bonding. Like we all grew up, he and his brother grew up working in ginseng. I grew up working in ginseng. There was something really primal,
Yeah.
both about digging your hands in the dirt, but also about like just knowing like, oh, we were doing this 30 years ago, 35 years ago, like it's something embedded in us. And there was still satisfaction, even though there wasn't a lot of roots in the ground. It was still very satisfying when you would pull those roots out, and fill up a bucket.
They're working in ginseng. Yeah.
So I think, like I miss that sort of like primal connection to labor. Like in weird ways, I miss manual labor, because there's something really honest about that work and honest and free about it, versus, working at a desk all day long,
Could make the argument that what you do is manual labor. You're working at a desk all day long. You're hunched over.
Yeah. No, yeah, and I work with my hands, and I actually have to put in the hours. It's not like a lot of new technology jobs where you're just kind of randomly pushing around data, and filling up time, and somehow you get paid. What I'm doing is tangible, so that's good. So maybe actually there are a lot of connections to being an artist and being a farmer. I mean, they're both creative, occupations. So like when I look at a farmer, it's like the purest form of that. Like they just take the earth and they plant something and they nourish a plant and raise it to its, harvest. It's the same thing you do as an artist.
Actually, that's an interesting thing because I kind of wanted to draw a connection between those two. Would you say that your upbringing, because there's a lot of freedom in your style, right? It breathes basically.
Mm-hmm.
You got these thick brush, smooth, flowy lines. Would you say that a lot of that you say that your upbringing has something to do with that? Maybe working in manual labor has something to do with that?
Yeah, I'm a rural cartoonist, I'm a peasant cartoonist. So I grew up in nature. And I feel fortunate for that, to spend so much time, in nature and outdoors and in the dirt. And that's certainly affected my style. I'm not Chris Ware and Dan Clowes, who are very urban cartoonists, Chris Ware is like a master of architecture. It's mind blowing, like his attention to detail and his accuracy and his like intimacy with architecture. I don't have that because I didn't grow up around buildings. I just grew up around fields and dirt. So
But that's another thing. Like Chris Ware is a master of grids, like making things stay in their panels and small minute changes between those panels. You use big artwork in your stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's a good observation. I feel like even the fact that rural America is more religious is connected to that, because when you go to those farming areas of the United States, like there's nothing. It's just like empty fields as far as the eye can see, and then sky. Like the sky is the dominant visual. So it just automatically turns your attentions towards the heavens, So I see where, and there, it's just the combination of the emptiness, but also just the presence of the sky, I think makes people more religious and spiritual. Whereas you go to a city and you're filled with all kinds of like stimulus and distraction and, and skyscrapers and people and actual things stimulating you. When you're in a country, there's nothing to really stimulate you. It's an emptiness and a quietness.
Do you think that's why somebody like Chris Ware tries to pack in as much information into a smallest space as possible?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, because with your work, with these 3 books, there's at least one page in each one that is just space. So like with Goodbye Chunky Rice, there is uh, I love the sea because it is boundless and it's really just the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And in Blankets, it's Raina dancing in the snow. And in Habibi, you have full pages that are just white.
I mean,
So
I'm
yeah,
always frustrated. To me, comics feels very claustrophobic a lot of times. As a reader, I talk about it being like an attic with all these boxes kind of jumbled and stacked on each other, and you don't know where to turn your attention. I think for people who didn't grow up with comics, for the uninitiated, it's very confounding to look at a page of comics, and it's very claustrophobic. Like it's just too many images crammed together. So I feel that as a reader, and I love comics, so like I'm every day when I'm working on a page, I feel this frustration that like, oh, I'm so confined by the page. I'm so confined by the panel. I wish I could draw expansive scenes that feel more like reality. I mean, ironically, 3D, film or
yeah.
whatever, or virtual reality is closer to human experience than what I do, even though I don't want to go and make virtual reality films, but I mean, like, yeah, the way we see the world is very, very wide lens, expansive, and yet I'm forced in comics to kind of really condense that into these small frames. So that's just a constant frustration. So whenever I can find this opportunity to somehow open up that composition, I do.
You know what's interesting about you saying that you feel confined by the page is that can actually be solved if you decide to go digital.
You're right. And yet maybe it's like being into religion. Like I'm kind of attached to the constraint.
Uh-huh.
I don't want infinite freedom in my artwork. I kind of want that forced frame.
It's like
I'm holding on to the book, as a format.
yeah, I mean,
I watched
how important are constraints in creativity?
um they're super crucial for me. I think they are for everyone, and whatever the Marshall McLuhan thing that the medium is the
The message,
message,
yeah.
like it's already communicates its own thing. I kind of half watched this documentary about the origins of the book basically, and about how human civilization started with papyrus until basically, oh, but the nature of papyrus really created really fluid writing because
Mhm.
papyrus has this real like the way it rolls out, it has these almost like this grid of lines in it, and it's really smooth, and you can write really quickly on papyrus. So earliest civilization was quite literate, and then we went into the Dark Ages, and the next written medium was parchment, which is animal hide, which takes like so much work to create. And when you create a sheet of parchment, it actually has the animal's spine going down the middle of it. So that's where the book came from. Before that, we had, papyrus scrolls, which were like a very fluid, flowing medium. Then we had freaking animal death, like sacrifice for our and that's where the book was born. Like the spine of the animals, where the spine of the book was stitched, and that's the term spine came from.
Human
But
history is morbid.
it's super morbid, and also it's interesting to think of like Eastern thought and religion versus that started moving to like the middle, like the Renaissance, and like Western thought, and like the fact that there was human like animal sacrifice associated with learning, and only rich people could have it because they were really expensive to produce, very difficult to write on parchment. It's more like writing on leather in a way. Like you have to be, and that's where the whole calligraphy style came from, is you had to be really slow and precise and chiseled in the way that you wrote. Meanwhile, like in China, they're creating paper, which is really what changed everything, and really encouraged this entirely different way of the calligraphy of like a very flowing, beautiful, ink line. But then Gutenberg creates like the printing press,
Yeah.
basically. And they learn that like, oh, things like it's a much harder, like say Arabic thought kind of had this, suddenly had this like little bit of a stagnation because it was really hard to translate Arabic text into the earliest designs of the printing press. So then like Western intellectual thought sort of got a little head start for it, but not a head start, but they got a little like a handicap in their favor for a while because it's really easy to typeset Roman numerals. And but yeah, like it's interesting, yeah, that the book itself came from this horrible, like the spine of an animal on the parchment. And like if I had grown up in a culture that had scrolls, I just think of the scroll as like researching some of the Chinese and Japanese scroll work for this project. I would love to work in that form, like it's so expansive, and so fluid. But I don't want to do it digitally. That seems like cheating.
Okay. That's fine. Yeah, I know also like original art collectors don't like the fact that some people do it digitally because it's like it's something that they can't have. But so
which is funny because on some level, like comics pages don't, I mean, it's hard to isolate a page of comics from a story. Like it sort of loses most of its power, I feel like, when you remove it from the rest of the pages. But I'm glad people still like value comics art at this point in history.
I mean, it's great. There's nothing like it, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing like it. With Ginseng Roots, you have produced the comic book debut of your brother on art duties. How did he feel about that? I do feel like in previous interviews, you have continually said that your brother was a better artist than you. Am I making that up or?
No, it's true. I would say when we were kids, certainly in terms of comics, he was much more creative and prolific than me. I was the one that would labor over like a cover design, but never get around to really drawing the comics themselves. And he would fill up pages and pages of comics because he was just, maybe it's because he was 3 years younger and he had less editorial filter in his brain. But he was way more playful and expressive and prolific as a cartoonist than me. I was really more anal retentive. And then when we were in high school, we were more into skateboarding than comics. And my brother kind of stayed with skateboarding a lot longer than me. I kind of moved from skateboarding to like dating relationships. That was kind of my shift.
Yeah, he outlines that in your chart here.
Oh yeah, he does. He does a great. I love that chart. And then I kind of rediscovered comics around age 20, and I don't think he did. He didn't like fall back in love with comics the way I did. He was working he very early on when he was still in high school taught himself HTML, and he kind of dove right into the digital web designing world while he was still in high school. So he was kind of that era of the 90s with the .com explosions, and like you would just had a lot of success in the digital web world. And I think he's sort of at that point in his career where he's like devoted his whole professional career to advertise, like kind of a brand management and advertising, like creating, like a lot of corporate brands. And he was eager to get back to more personal creative expression. And it's not that he ever stopped drawing. He's drawn all along. He just hasn't really drawn comics.
Yeah.
And so, and it's been awesome for us because for me, that's like kind of the purest foundation of my relationship to comics is sitting at like the dining room table and drawing on the same piece of paper with my brother.
Yeah.
And so being able to tap a bit of that has really just like given me hope or connection to comics again.
I just want to say, you have similar art styles. I wouldn't say he's better. It's different. The other thing is this story that he tells in issue number 2, where the older brother forces the younger brother to be the bad guy. I just want to say I am a younger brother. I have one older brother. And we didn't really have villain toys, so he forced me to be the sidekicks.
That's even worse. Because at least the bad guys are pretty cool.
Well, I mean, in the 80s, you had somebody like Skeletor who was kind of incompetent. So
He's a bad guy, though, right? I mean,
yeah,
oh, I see what you're saying.
he's
Yeah, he
kind of
wasn't that
incompetent.
cool, but he looks cool. He's probably the coolest looking He-Man figure, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, my brother gets to be He-Man and I'm Man at Arms or or
Again, Man at
whatnot.
Arms, way cooler looking character than He-Man, though.
But he's not the most powerful man in the universe.
I
So
mean, Cobra Commander's way more iconic than any of the good guy GI Joes, right?
I guess except for Snake Eyes.
Okay.
But yeah, maybe. I'm not really sure. Yeah, but again, this is another case where by being specific, you guys went universal. So I thought that was interesting.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Before we go, can I ask you a few more questions that you just need to give quick answers to? You have a very smooth line. What combination of brush and paper do you use to achieve that effect?
Nothing special. I use like this Canson Bristol board, which is made in like manga pads. It's pretty like cheap paper. It's just like when you go to the art supply store, it's just like manga paper, It's not great quality. I'm actually frustrated with that. I know people like Joe Sacco uses really high end Bristol where you have to buy individual sheets and it's like $5 per piece or something. But I've always just used those cheap pads of paper. And then I use the kind of cartoonist standard Winsor Newton series 7, number 2 or 3 watercolor brush. And these get frustrating too because I don't think they're as good a quality as they used to be. But and then I use this Speedball Super Black ink, India ink. And that too, I mean, all my materials I get frustrated with. And I hear a lot of cartoonists complain that, these media are going away. So the quality is going downhill, on paper, ink, and brushes. Like people don't use these things anymore. So the companies don't really put the work into the quality.
It's unfortunate.
But maybe it's a good thing too, because I'm like, maybe paper quality has gone down because they're not clear cutting, old growth forests anymore. So it's probably good reasons these things. And I know that these brushes are made from sables, which are adorable little animals. So some of that has become contraband in terms of international trade. You can't like kill these little. So like when I think about the fact that that's actual animal fur at the end of the brush, it kind of disturbs me a bit. So in that sense, maybe it's good to go digital, and plastic and. Yeah. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it seems to me like you've got a bit of I mean, you love what you do, but you do find aspects of it frustrating. Like, you're talking.
And that might be the Midwestern stoic thing. Like work has to be suffering to some degree, That's how he's grown up. Like work is hard labor, it's suffering, deal with it. So I think I try to carry over that kind of feeling of like, oh, you got to suffer a bit for your work into my art life.
Yeah, because you were talking earlier about how you hate drawing in perspective and.
Yeah, I don't enjoy doing that stuff. It just I feel like the reader deserves it, and a lot of times the work necessitates it. But maybe it doesn't, some of my favorite comics work is very kind of, I would say, crude and spontaneous in its execution. So I probably labor too much, more than I need to, but.
Well, we appreciate it. So.
Oh, thank you. Good.
In Habibi, you pull what I would like to call a magic trick, where you make us think that it's taking place in one time period, but it's not. When you were planning that out, how did you figure out how to execute that kind of blindside?
Have you ever seen the Orson Welles movie F is for Fake?
No.
It was the last film of his career, and he didn't finish it. He died before it was completed, and I think either his late wife or someone helped edit and complete the film after his death. In the opening scene of the movie, it's Orson Welles doing magic tricks, and he says, "The story I'm about to tell you is completely true until the middle, and then it's all lies." And then he starts the story, and he's doing this like biographical film about this Italian painter who is one of the great art. Um, what do you call it? Where you fake, like he would fake paintings of famous like Vermeer paintings and stuff, and he could pass them off to museums. An art forger. And so it's a documentary, the first half of the film. And then at a certain point, it stops being real. It just starts being lies. But you don't notice it happens, even though he tells you right up front, like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with a documentary, and then I'm going to fictionalize it starting midway through the movie. It's kind of amazing what it does to your brain, but what it says about storytelling in general. It's a great film.
Like,
so I kind of did the same thing with Habibi. In the opening scene, like in the second page, there's a motorcycle. So right away, it's like for the next 200 or 300 pages, not more than that, maybe 400 pages, you feel like you're in some 1001 Nights fairy tale landscape, you know, even though right up front there's that motorcycle to give you this hint that, like, no, this isn't actually a galaxy long, you know, far away, long ago, or whatever. It's the now, you know.
and I think it says an important message, because I think a lot of the things that are happening in those first 400 pages, not exactly to the detail, but a lot of it is probably still happening now. And
yeah, none of this stuff goes away. I mean, religion, just starting with religion, the fact that there's like all this conflict around the world around religion, and these religions go back thousands of years and kind of all go to the same source again. You know, it's like, wow, we're still having these conflicts that don't, I think people forget that the origins go back to these almost fantasy fairy tale old times.
oh, don't tell them any of that. They get mad when you say that.
Okay, maybe that's a good note to wrap up.
You mentioned earlier about working with Dark Horse, and you weren't working on the comics. Not a lot of people know this. You actually worked on an issue of Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
How'd that come about? How'd that come about? And did you ever have other characters that you wish you took a stab at?
So that was Brian Michael Bendis, who I think he's one of the big Portland comics celebrities. You know, like if there's anybody who established the comic scene of Portland, it's probably Brian Bendis, and he might be the epicenter. And he was a fan of Chunky Rice, and I think I was still working on Blankets. Yeah, Blankets hadn't came out, I don't think. And he reached out to me about doing a Spider-Man story, and I was so excited because as a kid, I loved Spider-Man. Then I was disappointed because the story he gave me involved zero Spider-Man, like outfit stuff, and it was just like Peter Parker in high school. It was basically kind of Blankets. So Blankets must have been out. And so, yeah, it was okay to do. You know, it was not as fun as I expected. The same thing happened with James Sturm. He contacted me about drawing a Fantastic Four series. And I was stoked because I also read the Fantastic Four as a kid. And I was like, oh, I want to draw the Thing. You know, that's going to be great. I thought it'd be a fun, you know, distraction from my more serious work. But then the script he gave me had zero superheroes. It just had the human counterparts, you know, the Reed Richards and whatnot. And that was not, I actually turned down that project because that's not what I wanted to draw.
And now you're in a position to turn that down.
Yeah. But then there was a third time an opportunity came around where Evan Dorkin and Mike Allred were working on a reboot of the Metal Men for DC. And that seemed like a cool project. It was Evan Dorkin writing it and Mike Allred penciling it, and Mike wanted me to ink it. But I inked like one page and it just wasn't fun. I love Mike Allred's artwork, but I don't like inking other people's work because for me, inking is so much about my own personal drawing and expression. And when I'm inking, I feel like I have to be true to somebody else's lines, and I'm not good at it's not that fun.
And people might think you have similar styles, but you don't. He's a little more
He's more precise. He was
precise.
definitely a
Yeah.
big inspiration for me. So Bone and Mad Men were the two comics that got me back into comics after like not looking at them at all through high school.
See, I could see you inking Jeff. Like I can
Mm,
see that easily. But you
yeah.
inking Mike, I can't really see it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Maybe Jeff's work has no, I don't know. In some ways more organic. It
I
could
think
be.
so. Yeah, that's one of
And
the things I found I really like about Mike's work is I can't really explain it because it looks organic, but it's not.
it's like Charles Burns. It's in the realm of Charles
Yeah.
Burns a little bit, where it's like sometimes you're like, a human being drew this. I don't quite like, how does he have such precision with both his brush and his anatomy? And yeah. And
Uh
he's so good at likenesses too. You know, when he did this Bowie book recently and all those
yes.
sort of books, it's like he can capture someone's caricature so well. It looks effortless in his work, but it's also kind of inhuman, that ability to be like, whoa, he's captured those people in so few lines.
Here's my last question. Between blankets and ginseng roots, uh after that, do you have any more plans to do more comics about your life?
Yeah, probably. I want to say no because when I'm doing autobio, I kind of hate it, and I'm like, I'll never do autobio again. That's how it feels.
Is this part of that whole work is suffering thing?
Partly, and I also in general am really sick of whatever I'm working on when I'm working on it, you know, and I always want whatever I do next has to be completely different. So definitely the next book will be completely different, but I think it's just inevitable that I'll do more autobio. And you know, like in 2014 and 15, I worked on a collaboration with Edmond Baudouin, this French
Mm.
cartooning master. He's like 78 years old now, and I abandoned our collaboration. We probably got 100 pages into it, and I lost steam. So that's a project I'd like to pick up again. Um, I think it'll be a weird project to pick up again because we were in the middle of it, and then I abandoned it, and it's probably going to be 10 years that go by. But if I do find the energy to go back to it, I think that could be really compelling to go
What's it
back to
about?
something you've abandoned for a decade.
What's it about?
That's the thing. I don't know what it's about, even though we did 100 pages. I mean, it's about the fact that I don't speak French and Edmond doesn't speak English, and we're working on a collaboration together, trying to communicate through like sort of kindergarten like level language abilities and drawing.
Oh, so it's like that mini comic you did with James Kachalka,
Uh, except that like
except
communication is very difficult with Edmond.
bigger.
So
Yeah,
I mean, like we really do bond on an emotional level, but we have very limited verbal communication skills with each other.
it's interesting.
So, I mean, if I were smart, I would sit down and teach myself French so that that project would be a lot more fluid. But also, again, the struggle is part of the message of the whole project is like, oh, we don't know how to communicate except through drawings.
That's
But
interesting.
it's a
Yeah.
struggle to figure out how to make that work and what that means to do a book when you can't communicate.
And once again, that's comics bridging a social gap for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. I'd be looking forward to seeing that. Thank you, Craig. This has been an amazing
Yeah, dude.
interview.
Thank you. Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a good evening over there, right?
Yeah, and you have a good day.
All right, you get a second cup of coffee now.
All right.